friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, ladies and gentlemen. You are tuned to the MC Lars podcast. This is episode 58. It is October 7th, 2019. I'm here with Blake J. Harris this week. But before we get into that, I wanted to give a shout out to my tour mates, Oakley Dokley. They dress up like Ned Flanders and play heavy metal, or as they call it, heavy nettle. You may have seen one of their music videos at the end of The Simpsons recently. They're very fun to tour with. We've been on tour on the West Coast. Today I play Arcata, California by myself, which is in the top part of the state. I love that area so much. I'm so thankful to be able to come and play a show for the fans up there. I'm by myself for the Arcata show, but I've been in California with my homies. And then tomorrow we play Bellingham, Washington, then Portland, Oregon, then Seattle, Washington, and we end the tour in Denver on the 13th. So nerdcoretour.com for tickets and all of that. Please come say what's up. Blake J. Harris, this dude is a G. Megaran and I wrote a song about the console wars, and I just cold emailed him from his website. He listened to it, emailed us back, told us how much he loved it, and we kept in touch. He lives in New York. He is someone who has interesting perspective because whereas a lot of like technological historians are very obsessed with the technical developments, I love Harris's work because he really focuses on the human side of the stories. And Console Wars is such an amazing book. We get into it on the podcast, how Seth Rogan and Evan Goldberg turned it into a TV series and a documentary because they just thought it was a cool idea. But I love the book because he really brings the drama to life of the competition. And so we get into some of his inspiration for his works. We talk about his new book, The History of the Future, about virtual reality. And Blake J. Harris, he's a freaking awesome dude. And he's the kind of guy I feel like I could be friends with. So this week's episode is brought to you by the Patreon Larsens. Shout out to the new ones, Cold Guy, Jeff Christian, and Chris Shirley. Thank y'all. And some of the old OGs, Mark Hoffman, Mike Chellin, and Becca Alden. Patreon.com/MCLars. You sign up, you get 2 new songs a month. You get access to the entire proprietary back catalog of MC Lars songs. You get merch. You get the phone number where you can call and be on the show. It's all good. So be sure to check that out. But in the meantime, this is my interview with the legendary author and historian, Blake J. Harris. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Blake J. Harris, author, screenwriter, producer. He's written for ESPN, IGN, Fast Company, The Huffington Post, and the AV Club. He has 2 wonderful books out that I recommend you all check out. Console Wars, Sega Nintendo and the Battle That Defined a Generation, and The History of the Future, Oculus, Facebook, and the Revolution That Swept Virtual Reality. Blake, thank you for being on the podcast, man. Did I get all that right?
You got it all right. Sounds very impressive when you put my 7 years of my life together like that. And thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of yours, especially your Console Wars inspired song. Hey. But it's cool to meet in person. It's really nice.
Thank you, Blake. We met because Megaran and I wrote that song. And then I just emailed you from your site, and you were kind enough to listen and write us back. And we were so excited when you checked out the song.
Yeah, which I don't get because I was the one who was like fanboying out, like so excited, like, oh my God, these guys wrote a song about this book. And as I told you when I first got here, you know, I'm hoping that we can maybe use it in the documentary because it's so good. It's also so thematically and like narratively on point. So
thanks, man. It was fun because it was like Megaran and I was like, all right, we have homework. We got to read this book, figure out the points, follow the drama arc, and name check all the important characters. And it's a really special book because, well, obviously you were or are passionate about video games. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we'll get a little bit into my backstory in a bit, but basically the thing is that I suck at video games. Like I never really got into first person shooters, which is a lot of what it is. So I suck at that. I don't really play that. I play a lot of stuff on the Nintendo Switch because that's more my speed. But because I feel such a debt to the industry of video games, because that's made my career, and because I think not enough people cover it the way that I cover it. Like even if I don't play Destiny or Call of Duty, like I'm so interested in the making of process, and so I love the gaming space.
And it changes so quickly. I mean, I remember I felt like there was this shift when one of my albums, the biggest press I got was on the IGN website, realizing that video games started to drive culture. And seeing that shift, like when I started doing music, like maybe 15 years ago, a little bit longer, like that there's so much to keep up with. It used to be movies and music were enough, but now it's like video games kind of combine all that, you know?
Yeah, it really does. And that's kind of where we're headed in a sense, not to get like too far out there or potentially dystopian, but just the idea of, so much of the video games being made today, or at least the number of people, because there's so many independent creators that are making video games. Maybe it's not the AAA game, or definitely not the AAA games that but they're using these game engines like Unity and Unreal. And those get more and more cinematic and movie-like as we go on, where you're buying assets, you're buying the best looking trees. And, we are going to get to a place where what you're making, it looks, right now it could be like a Pixar-esque movie, but like, as those things get more and more lifelike, you're going to be sort of directing from your computer this virtual world that looks quite real.
And that's exciting as long as like the narrative and the humanity's still there, if it all becomes AI storytelling, it might be this kind of uncanny valley kind of vibe.
Yeah. It'll be interesting too. Cause, I think obviously inherently one of the coolest things about video games, like an open world game, like even just GTA is, anything can happen. You have total autonomy, and that's awesome. But that's also the opposite of what's so cool about movies and music and books, which is that the director is sort of creating a very specific experience, and that it's a shared experience. And maybe I'm just old fashioned, but I love having that shared cultural experience with people. And one person's GTA experience is going to be so different than another's. Whereas, seeing Batman Forever, an awesome movie, is like, we're both going to have the same experience, even if I might think it's amazing and you might think it's not as good. Because
with the open world sandbox, right? If we were both to discuss GTA or maybe Mario Odyssey, I might mention something that you didn't know about a certain level. Right. It's a different frame of reference. And
it's a lot more like, I was trying to think about an analogy. It's a lot more like going on vacation. Like I would say to you, like going to Hawaii is awesome. And you're like, I love Hawaii too. But the things we love about Hawaii are very different, though there probably is just sort of like a vibe to it that is a little je ne sais quoi aspect that it does share in common, but everyone's experience is going to be different.
You grew up in Chappaqua in Westchester County?
Yes, I grew up in Chappaqua, home to the Clinton family.
Hey.
Prior to writing Console Wars, I think my biggest claim to fame was that in 5th grade, I dated the girl who would later run over the Clintons' dog. That was like my pickup line. No, that was like...
Is that true?
Yes.
Oh my God.
I wouldn't make up such a sad fact. Yes.
Wow. So you dated her before or after?
Dated her before.
Right. Oh my gosh. And so you were so the Clintons were your neighbors.
Yeah, but the Clintons moved there during I think like my sophomore junior year of high school. So it was a very big deal at the time.
Yeah.
But I'm sure it's different than people growing up in Chappaqua now, where the Clintons are sort of part of the fabric of the small town.
And where does Hillary live? Does she live up there now, or she's in Rhinebeck? Or
I think they're mostly up there.
Yeah.
Though I definitely voted for Hillary, and I was devastated when she lost. And this might be relevant because we'll maybe get into politics with my new book later. But but I always thought it was like a bad sign for her and a good sign for Bill that although I don't live in Chappaqua anymore, I have a lot of friends and their families that live there, and they would always say such nice things about Bill, like he was such a member of the town. And I was like, well, what about Hillary? And they're like, we just never see her. She was never there. And obviously it's partly because she's busy, but I think she also, she doesn't have that bonding ability that Bill has.
Yeah, right. That warm networking ability.
Yeah, like everyone was like, oh, every time you walk into Lang's Little Store Deli, Bill's there and he knows your name and like he puts a smile on your face. And I don't know. I guess as someone who grew up liking Bill, it's nice to hear that, but it was a bummer that Hillary wasn't making that same impression on my childhood town.
I saw a podcast where you talked about how you've always voted Democrat as a Democrat.
Yeah.
And so what year did you graduate high school?
I graduated from Horace Greeley, the high school there in 2001.
Oh, we're same age.
Oh, okay.
That's awesome.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in California, like Central Coast near the Bay Area. And so the first candidate I voted for was Al Gore because I just turned 18 right before the 2000 election.
So that's good. Yeah, I'm December, so I missed it by like a month and a half.
Wow.
But I was very upset when Gore lost to Bush. I was very excited for that 15-minute time when I thought Gore had gotten Florida and beaten Bush.
Right. The truth, like that was an interesting introduction to politics. Like truth isn't always, there's no real political truth. You know what I mean? Like that was a shift. It felt like.
I definitely didn't feel that way back then. Now I absolutely feel that way. Cause for me, I guess it started to happen 4 years later. The first election that I did vote in, I voted for John Kerry. And I remember I was in London visiting my girlfriend at the time and we watched the debate. And it was like probably the first time I really sat through and watched like a full 2-hour debate. And I just remember walking away being like, oh, Kerry crushed Bush. Like there's not a single person who could vote for Bush. And meanwhile, like Bush apparently did better than expected. And so he won, and he obviously won the election. But so that was my first introduction to, it could be the same scene and different people of different political stripes see it very differently.
That's interesting talking about like the open world, like to make a metaphorical connection.
Yeah.
Then you started writing screenplays, right? Was that after high school and college? Was that your first inroad into writing, or?
So what happened was, basically for most of my childhood and high school, I was pretty lazy, I would say, or I definitely was not intellectually curious. And then it wasn't until my senior year in high school that I started reading books for fun. And I first started reading like Catcher in the Rye, Great Gatsby, all these books that I had never read that I should have read, or that I maybe had done the Cliff's Notes for, but never actually cared about. And then after I fell in love with reading and thought like, wow, I'd love to be a person who's writing these kinds of things. And I went to Georgetown for college, and by the end of my freshman year, I knew that I wanted to be a writer. Like that was my dream. I certainly didn't have the talent at that point, but I started writing short stories and stuff. My junior year, I went abroad, and I went abroad to Spain purely because it was like the least amount of courses, so I'd have the most amount of time to write a novel, which I did.
Wow. And
I'm sure it sucks,
Did you ever release it, or is it
release it as if someone would want to read this thing? No, I never did. But yeah, at least I started putting in the reps, and I definitely think there's validity to like the sort of the 10,000 hours aspect thing, because it was what I always wanted to do. Whenever I had free time, I would write, or I would be reading and thinking about writing, and I guess I did always want to write the great American novel. That was the initial dream, but I had no idea how to monetize writing, what the career path would be. I applied to some film schools and some creative writing MFA programs, mostly just because that was like a path. Right. And, I was like a good Jewish boy growing up, and my parents wanted me a doctor or lawyer, and they wanted me on a path, like you're going somewhere. Right. And I'm like, well, I'm getting better at writing, but that wasn't like a certificated path. So I ended up getting into a few schools, got rejected from most of them. And I ended up deciding I thought I could either go to a creative writing MFA program, like I got into the New School, or I can go to a film school at Loyola Marymount. But I kind of realized that one thing I had that most writers don't have was not talent, but it was that I was self-sufficient and I was like a self-starter. I did write a lot of stuff, and I spoke to people who went to school, and they said that was the best part of film school or creative writing school for them, was that it made them write. And I was like, well, I'm going to write anyway, so maybe I don't want to come out of the school $100,000 in debt.
Right.
And so I ended up getting a job trading commodities for a financial broker in New York, and I traded sugar, coffee, and soybean futures for Brazilian clients for 7.5 years, from the week after I graduated college until literally the day of my 30th birthday. And that was what I did throughout my entire 20s. And one of the best parts of that job was that the market for commodities futures closed at 2:15. So I would get out of there at 2:15 and be able to work on screenwriting, which I thought was my best chance at finding some financial success or career. And then I also produced a couple of movies and spec TV shows, pilots.
And so one of which was The Flying Scissors.
Yes.
So can we talk about that briefly?
Yeah.
What was that like? It was like it's a mockumentary, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So The Flying Scissors was like a 90-minute long mockumentary about competitive rock, paper, scissors. And this was at a time when Arrested Development was canceled. So it was like my favorite show in the world, but it felt like only a few people, brilliant people like me, appreciated it. And The Office was just starting on NBC, and that wasn't doing so well, but it was like, like totally in my wheelhouse. And so my buddy Jonah Toulis and I went to high school with Jonah, and he's currently my co-director on the Console Wars documentary, so someone who I've had a very long and nice relationship with, but we went through some tough years. And, we wrote the script for The Flying Scissors, for this movie about competitive rock, paper, scissors, and mockumentary. And then Jonah, who had a background in film at Colgate, whereas my background is a little more in writing, he's like, hey, we should produce this. Like, we should make it. And I was like, I was like, well, like, I was saving up money at that point to go to maybe try to give film school another shot. I was living with my grandma, so I was saving a lot of money. And I said, like, oh, how much do you think we can make it for? And he said, oh, like $5,000. And I was like, all right, well, I can put in $2,500 and he'll put in $2,500, like, whatever. Like, it's a lot of money, but it's worth it. Well, as these things often happen, especially the first time, it ended up costing about $125,000. So it became like a big money pit. And for, I wouldn't say good reason, but for understandable reason, where it's like every step of the way, it was like you can either have like the D plus experience, the C experience, or the A experience. And like it was our baby. We wanted to get the best casting director. We wanted to get SAG-AFTRA talent. We didn't want to skimp, and then just kept adding up. And that made it a really tough situation, as I'm sure any creator can relate to, where you're putting your own money into it and sort of you start to lose sight, or not even lose sight, but like the creative becomes so emotionally mixed with the financial burden of it. Yeah. And that made it really hard. It made it a really difficult experience at the time. And
you were young. You're still young, but you were like a young new writer. So it's like this. You probably saw as like, oh, this is a way to like prove ourselves as a creative team. Yeah.
Yeah, and like our best case scenario and kind of what we were hoping for and motivated us was like, oh, we'll make this movie and then we'll get into Sundance, and then people will give us briefcases of money and we'll like rule the world. And obviously that's not what happened. And not even close. We didn't get into Sundance. We didn't get into any film festival we applied to except for one. And Jonah said we shouldn't go to that one because then it would look weird. Like we only got into one, which was what happened. So we didn't go to that. So it was actually a real bummer of an experience, because we had spent like all the money we had for films, all the money to make something else, all the money we had for me to quit my job and have some security. But after like probably a year and a half, when there was some emotional distance from the financial investment, we were sort of able to look at it more objectively and say, all right, we made this mockumentary about competitive rock, paper, scissors. It's not The Godfather. It's not the kind of movie that's going to play at Sundance. But you know what? It is like a really fun movie. It's not like it's good. It's not embarrassing. We didn't make a bad movie. And so we thought, like, who would want to watch this movie? People like us, people who were in college a few years younger than us, it's totally up their alley. Maybe they're stoned, drunk. It's like a good movie to have on in the background. And so I contacted the group at Georgetown that selected the movies that would play, like the student activity committee. And back then, between when movies were in theaters and when they came out on DVD, they would play some movies like at one of the, auditoriums. And so I said, would you be interested in playing this movie? And we made a trailer, and the trailer was really good because it was only 2 minutes long, and maybe that's how long Rock, Paper, Scissors movie should be. But anyway, that went well. Georgetown agreed to play it, and I thought, well, why don't I just contact other schools? And I ended up contacting like 500 different schools, doing some serious level internet stalking, because I was like, all right, Ithaca, who decides what movies get played at Ithaca? All right, this committee, who's the movie director of this committee? It was like a 19-year-old freshman girl, and I was like, all right, how do I get her email address? So I felt kind of creepy, but the best part of that experience was that I think, we did contact like 500 schools or something like that. And I think, and in the end, 42 of them said yes. And some of them paid us to play the movie. And that was just a great life experience, because it was the first time in my life that I was fine with putting myself out there and hearing no so many times over, because each yes was worth like, who cares if I got 50 no's? And that would be something that at the time I didn't realize how valuable it was, but it was when I ended up falling into journalism and contacting people for Console Wars, because I got a lot of no's. And I know the kind of person I was before that, I probably would have been like, oh, no one wants to talk to me, kind of sad, kind of use that as an excuse to not go further. But, I got used to just putting myself out there and being rejected and being totally fine with it, because sometimes you don't get rejected and it's worth it.
Yeah, and if you're not ever rejected, you're never gonna get those yeses. That's like a great lesson. And you got a thick skin to the rejection. Didn't mean it was a failure. It just meant you were one step closer to finding the movie's audience. Right. Yeah.
And then you also see, like, if you're not doing it at such a high number of, like if we hadn't applied to over or sent it to over 100 people, or I guess a good way to put it is we got rejected from pretty much every film festival. So I think it's maybe an easy takeaway would be, wow, the movie's not good. But when you're doing something and you're getting 20% of people to agree to it, you see that there's something there. So maybe it's just about the presentation. Like, why are those 80% of people saying no? Maybe it's just the presentation. Maybe they could be part of that yes group. Like, it's not it was just really a good life experience for me. So I encourage people listening to get rejected a lot so that you can get better at pitching yourself.
And it's funny because you talked about how now you and your creative partner are working on this Console Wars adaptation. And so it's like your career has been this interesting circuitous return to this initial like impetus for writing, right? Like,
yeah.
Let's talk about Console Wars. That came out in 2014, right?
Yep.
How long was the process writing it? Like what was the process from I'm going to do this to like it being in stores?
Sure. So it came out in May 2014. All in all, I would say it was about a 3-year process, but I would also note that for the first year and a half of that, I had that day job trading commodities, so it wasn't a full-time process, whereas my more recent book was a much more of like a 9 to 9 or whatever like job. So it originally started with what had happened was during my 20s, my friend and partner Jonah and I would write screenplays and write stuff that we produced. We produced a television pilot called The Super Agent about a talent agent who represents superheroes. And
that's good.
Yeah. And so like we were trying to do stuff, get our name out there, get better at what we were doing. And finally we wrote a script that was really good, that I think that, everything is subjective in the art world, but it was a good script. It would have done well for our career. Maybe it wouldn't have gotten made, but it would have gotten us good meetings. And it was called The Sordid Tales of an Evil Tyrannical Ex-Dictator. And it was about like a Ricky Gervais type of dictator, like an arrogant but funny, blasé dictator who gets overthrown from his wealthy European country and ends up in the United States in the witness protection program, working at the DMV in New Jersey until his life catches up with him. And it's an action comedy. And it was a real fun movie. There was something to it. And then about a week after we finished our script, Sacha Baron Cohen announced that he was going to do a movie called The Dictator.
Oh, wow.
And and like, especially back then, like dictator was like it just wasn't a common word. Like I felt like there was not, that really, I guess what I'm saying is that really took the wind out of our sails. And no one in Hollywood had any interest in reading our script at that point, even though he hadn't written a script yet, even though maybe our movies were very different. And the conclusion I came to after, I was devastated, but it was also like, I understood it. I understood why a producer would much rather try to work with Sacha Baron Cohen or wouldn't want to compete against Sacha Baron Cohen, because he'd done amazing things and he was a well-known name, and that's kind of how it should be. Like, I wouldn't want to take the risk on an unknown like me. So after that, I kind of realized that I'm going to be writing for the rest of my life because it was something I loved, but I probably was not going to make money doing it. So what I needed to do was to work on projects that I absolutely loved with no financial goal in mind. And, that of course was the one that ended up having some financial reward for it. But that was how I started working on Console Wars, because a few weeks after that, my brother got me a Sega Genesis for my birthday or for Christmas. They're both in December, and and I was playing the Genesis, playing NHL 94, and thinking, wow, I haven't played video games in so long, and wow, I really love this. Like, this was such a big part of my childhood, and I wanted to just know more about the behind-the-scenes story because I love reading behind-the-scenes books. So before I ever wanted to write a book like Console Wars, I just wanted to read one. And I went to a Barnes & Noble on 86th Street in Manhattan, and there was, as I've told you before, there was a movie history section and a music history section, but there was no video game history section. And when I went to ask the woman at the information desk, where's the video game history books, she laughed at me. I asked for one of the books on Sega, Nintendo, or video game history, or business of video games. And, they always are like, oh, well, I can order this book for you. But they didn't even offer that. Like, they were like, nope, there's no such book.
Right.
Which I thought was crazy. So in the entire 2-story gigantic Barnes & Noble, the only video game related things they had in the entire store were walkthrough guides. And, I later did some research and realized that there were video game books. There's a great book by David Sheff about Nintendo that's kind of like my book is about Sega. And there's a great book by Stephen Kent about the history of video games. But there were so few. They certainly weren't really like commercially mainstream well-known. And that's sort of what set me off on writing Console Wars, was just me wanting to understand this story. Like David Sheff's book is really great. It is probably, of all the video game books out there, the one that's most like mine, where it's like a behind the scenes character driven story. But his book ends in 1992, 93, where Nintendo's on top of the world.
Right.
There's this thing called the World Wide Web that's coming. There's like multimedia CDs are the big buzz, and Sega in his book had already been like defeated. And I was like, no, now is like when it's getting so exciting. So I always kind of viewed my book as like a sequel to that. But yeah, from there, I just started reaching out to people who had worked at Sega or Nintendo. I used as a resource on a website that I often made fun of and still sometimes make fun of, which was LinkedIn.
Right.
And I was just like, well, okay, this person was at Sega from 1992 to 1994. Most of the responses I got were no response or no. But then, like 15% of people said, sure, I'll talk to you about it. At that point, I probably said that I was interested in writing a book or maybe a screenplay. And then I ended up just building up a portfolio of people. I started interviewing people. I had never done that before. And then as I was finding this incredible story, I was talking with Jonah, and he suggested we do a documentary. And I thought that seemed like that would not take away from a book or from a movie or, well, now a TV show. And like, because my thought was that this was sort of like the social network of video games in the 90s. It was a generation defining technology-based experience. And I saw a lot of Moneyball aspects to it, how Sega was able to compete with like 1/10 of the budget. And both Moneyball and The Social Network were movies that I loved, and thought, hey, I would also love a documentary of those movies. Like I'd love to see Billy Bean or Zuckerberg or the Winklevi. And then, from there it took... over the next year, I kept interviewing people. I ended up getting connected with Tom Kalinske, who's the main character of the book, and that really told me that there was a great story here. Seth Rogan and Evan Goldberg and Scott Rudin came on board, and then finally I quit my job and could work on this full time. And I spent all of 2013 writing the book, and then it came out in 2014.
So that's awesome. So you had so it started as a passion project because there wasn't the financial like anxiety of, this needs to make a ton of money right away.
Yeah. And that's something that I notice happen a lot because, since then I've probably interviewed over 1,000 people. I've interviewed a lot of people in the film space because of the work I do and have done with How Did This Get Made, Paul Scheer's podcast.
Yeah.
And like a lot of times, like I always like to hear people's origin story. And it's surprising to me, though maybe it shouldn't be, how often it is where it's the one project that's just pure passion and, not the commercial one that ends up breaking through. And I think that gives us, that tells us that somehow the audience can tell when something comes from a passionate place, and that you can't necessarily replicate that. And it's a interesting thing to think about too, because I'm sure you've done work that's passion fueled, and I'm sure you've done work that you wouldn't consider that. But it's not like when you do the work that's not passion fueled, you're not passionate about it. Like, because I think you put your heart into everything you do, from what I've listened to. But there's just a different, like that Dictator script I really enjoyed, but it wasn't like my baby. It wasn't like I'm going, no matter what happens, I'm gonna walk through hell to get this sort of project. And those ones seem to really connect with people.
Interesting. That's really an inspiring piece of wisdom for people. How did you first get in touch with Seth Rogan? Did you send him the manuscript or something? Or
yeah, good question. So it was before I had written the book. I had a book proposal at that point, so there was not that much that there would have been to send. But like I told you before we started the show, that as much as I want both of my books, or I think of both my books as just great human stories that would appeal to anyone. I always write with my grandma in mind and make sure that she would find these worlds interesting. But they are really just 500-page case studies, like business studies, and there's a lot of lessons that I personally learned from each of them. And one of the ones with Sega was that Sega couldn't afford Tom Hanks, Dustin Hoffman's, the A-listers of the world to promote their product. They just didn't have the money, but they could afford young celebrities who were more likely to reach the market that they wanted anyway. And so I had read, I literally Googled celebrity gamers. Seth's name came up.
Oh.
Seth was, he was an A-lister pretty much at the time, but he wasn't what he is now. And but I should also just totally make it clear that when I asked my manager to send Seth like a 25-page treatment that I wrote, I had zero expectation I was going to ever hear back from him. It wasn't like a calculated strategic play. It was more like a, why not? Like, maybe this guy will listen. And I would have reached out to people who are way less famous than him, but I was shocked, and it was life-changing to hear that he wanted to meet with me. I met with him and Evan on January 6th, 2013. No, sorry, 2012. So over 7.5 years ago now, we've been working with them. And I realized during that meeting, we met for 2 hours. It was obviously surreal to meet with, one of my favorite actors and life-changing and all that. But it was also just the first time in my entire writing, any creative career, that I met with a decision maker. Because he called back my manager later that day and said, I want to do it. He was going to produce the movie based on the book, which is now going to be a TV show. He was going to produce the documentary for me and Jonah to direct, and he was going to end up writing the foreword to the book. And I was just like, wow. And I've never met with someone. It was always, every other meeting I had was like, all right, maybe it sounds interesting. Right. My people will call your people. But so that was life-changing, though a few days later I was back at my day job at 6:45 in the morning, and I was like, I thought my life was supposed to change, and it eventually did. Scott Rudin got involved because Seth had a meeting with him, and he was telling me about this project, and so all of that really was a life-changing experience. It was, and I finally, on my 30th birthday, I quit my day job, or that was my last day of my day job, and I was able to write full time, and I have since then. And I'm wearing shorts today, which makes sense because it's September and it's still warm, but I literally wear shorts every day and sandals because that's my, my mental symbolic thing that I'm free from the corporate world. And so I'm going to wear shorts no matter what the weather, like those UPS guys who wear them into the winter.
You wear sandals in the winter too, or no?
I generally do.
Wow.
Unless it's really thick snow.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. I should also say I rarely leave my apartment. I'm kind of a recluse, so it's not as dramatic as it might sound. But yeah, I mean, the last 7 years of my life have been awesome. I wake up every day, I get to write and interview people, and that's my dream. So I get upset about petty, stupid things like we all do, but I never lose sight of the fact that this is so much better than my life used to be, and that I'm grateful that I get to do this.
And you worked to get to that point by entrepreneurial people bet on themselves, right? That's
yeah. I mean, that's how I view the world. I've always loved entrepreneurship. That really is what both of my books are about. Oculus and Sega are both just great entrepreneurial stories. I find those inspiring. There's the formula for success changes all the time. Luck is a big part of it. So with all those caveats, I'm fortunate for a lot of factors outside of my control. Fortunate that Seth happened to look at this thing.
Yeah.
But I think that what I found was that maybe I wouldn't be in this position. Maybe I still would have a day job. But after I found that project I loved and was committed to doing it till the end and sort of found that passion, I would have done that with another project too. And maybe I wouldn't have been able to do it at the scope I've been doing. But I think that entrepreneurial spirit works in whatever level you're at, and that's what I love in people.
That, and I think also something about the entrepreneurial spirit that comes through in your first book is, how do you say his name? Tom Kalinske?
Yeah, Tom Kalinske.
Tom Kalinske, it has a Shakespearean drama to it because there are tragic flaws. It's the Shakespearean tragedy. You have a tragic flaw, a series of unfortunate events, and then something mysterious or supernatural, right? And so there was the hubris of Nintendo, and one of the most interesting scenes is the one where you talk about how Nintendo almost owned PlayStation, right?
Yep.
And that was such a example of their hubris getting in the way of their success.
Yeah. I mean, in both my book, I remember a friend asked me recently if I would ever be interested in writing fiction, and I love writing, so I'd be interested in writing anything. But then I said, I was like in Console Wars, the Tom Kalinske fights for Sega, the parent company in Japan, to do their next generation system, which turned out to be the Saturn. That instead of that, they should do a partnership with Sony, which would have been the Sega PlayStation, or they would have done a partnership with Silicon Graphics, which is what ended up becoming the N64. So there's the Shakespearean element where he tried to create these two devices that ended up being his demise. And then in my more recent book, 2 years before Palmer Luckey got fired for political related aspects, there was an email he sent to a developer that was unrelated to really politics, but he said that we don't want to become one of those big megacorps that tells their employees what views they're allowed to share. Oh, wow. And it's just both of those things. I know that if it was fiction, my editor would say oh, that's too on the nose, too much foreshadowing. But in real life, that stuff happens, and it's amazing, and it's beautiful, and it's sad, and that's what I love writing about.
And so talking about history of the future, speaking of you as an investigator, I saw one of your interviews where you talk about how Palmer Luckey would always space everything with 2 sentences. But you saw one of his posts was with 1 space between sentences, so you knew that he hadn't written it, where he talked about who he was voting for.
Yeah, that was my first clue. So after Console Wars came out in May 2014, within the year, I was working on this Oculus book and, very seriously working on. I ended up spending about 3.5 years working on it. The original due date was September of 2016. That was when the manuscript was due to HarperCollins. But that was also the same month within within a week of when Palmer Luckey was outed as a Trump supporter in a headline that said that he was funding all these white supremacist memes, which was not, that part was not true. He was and is a Trump supporter. And my whole story turned upside down. So the book ended up taking 2 years longer. And there was a lot of investigation. And one of the, after Palmer was alleged to be a Trump supporter from that article, and all these negative things were coming out about him, and, the public figure will make the public statement either saying it's true or not, and we can believe them or not. But he made a public statement on his Facebook page that said that he planned to vote for Gary Johnson, which I knew was not true, because I had been in touch with Palmer. I had already talked to him about his Trump support. So either he was lying to me or he was lying to the public. And then I came to realize that his Facebook post where he said he was voting for Gary Johnson only used 1 space after a period, which is different than his usual 2 spaces after the period, which I had noticed because I told him how annoying it was, because I would often transcribe emails that people had pre-Facebook acquisition had given to me, and then post-Facebook acquisition people had leaked to me because I wasn't allowed to get public company internal communications. But that was like my first clue. Or I guess my instinct was that Palmer hadn't written that, but I also assumed that Palmer had maybe been sort of like persuaded into writing that. Like that it was his decision to write that, even if it wasn't true. But then I came to believe, no, he was forced to write that. And then I ended up learning that the person who had written that statement that he posted, which lied about his politics, was written by Mark Zuckerberg. And that really changed the scope of my book. Also because, there have been a lot of Facebook scandals or controversies or questions over the past 1.5 years. And this is the first one where I think Mark is actually at the center. Every other one, Mark can say, oh, that's not my department, or I didn't know. But Mark literally wrote the statement that Palmer posted, which lied about his political beliefs. And Palmer had to post that or lose his job, which I found really bad. And, we've talked about my support of Hillary Clinton, and I've always voted Democrat. And so I very much don't like Donald Trump, but I do believe everyone should have the option to support whichever candidate they choose without risk of their career being threatened, especially when it's a mainstream one of 2 candidates in a 2-party political system.
Yeah. And when it's this idea that if you sell your invention to a big corporation, do you then abdicate your freedom of speech?
Right.
I mean, that's the question, right?
And that gets into like just a larger question that we're all facing nowadays, where the personal and professional line is so blurred, and where I really have a lot of problems with it, because this book made me really look a lot at journalism and how inaccurate journalism is, and how much it's based on, this game of the person who writes the article doesn't write the headline, so the headline's not accurate, but the person who writes the article doesn't feel bad because they didn't write the wrong headline, and the person who wrote the headline says, oh, I'm just writing the headline, I didn't write the article. So this like diffusion of responsibility. But I see a lot of journalists post stuff on Twitter, and it's like, seems very unprofessional to me, but they could maybe make the case that that's just like the personal side of their life. But yeah, we see that more and more, just what you do in your personal life, a lot of people want that to have an impact on your professional life, oftentimes to have you lose your job or to make your employer aware of it. And so, I think with Palmer Luckey, one of my favorite parts of the story is that, some people have said to me after reading it, like, oh, am I supposed to feel bad for Palmer? Am I supposed to sympathize with him? And my answer to that is, you should feel however you want. Right. But I just think that he is such a great proxy for all these things that are going on nowadays, and they happen to people in different degrees. And no, you don't really need to feel bad for Palmer. He made a lot of money. He now has another company that is worth $1 billion, and that's because he's an incredible entrepreneur and a brilliant guy. But but maybe you don't need to feel bad for Palmer. But the next time you read a headline about someone who's allegedly a racist, you will try to think, well, what is that actually based on? Or should I join the mob to try to get them to lose their job when I don't actually know more information? And just, so much of our life just is lived digitally these days. And the digital world is a pretty crazy place. And Palmer's story and what happened with him at Facebook really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And I think it's just a good avatar for a lot of that stuff.
And it's interesting when you're writing, you're probably thinking about how you are synthesizing all this history and projecting in the future. And there's this idea probably that like in 10 years, 20 years, people might point at the history of the future in college textbooks, college class, and be like, this is a textbook. This explains like where things were shifted. And Lucky Palmer is an example of someone who, like you said, manifests that transition. Right. And so that's interesting because that happened, you said, towards the end. And so you had to extend the deadline to tell this story. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, like the console words that subtitle is generation, the battle that defined a generation. Part of that's tongue in cheek, but I do feel like there's a very generational aspect to it. A lot of people have a certain very excited and nostalgic feeling when you talk about Sega Nintendo. And I really thought of that book as a time capsule. I really wanted to capture the time. And so beyond the business narrative and the characters, like, there was one part of Console Wars where we went into the MTV Movie Awards through Howard Stern and his character Fart Man. And we could have just got to the actual information of that, but I felt like that was just so indicative of the 90s.
Right.
That Howard Stern was famous and that he was famous for playing this guy Fart Man. And so I always try to bring in other elements of the culture so that it feels like it captures a lot of these things. And that was true of this book too, though I didn't realize the ways at first. I really thought of it more as like a time capsule of the gaming period. That's why there's a lot of references to Ouya, which was also another successful Kickstarter company about a month before Oculus. And then a lot of this political stuff, I just felt like it is so indicative of this time that we're living in. And Palmer was such a perfect proxy for all these issues. And it was, turned out to be a sad ending. And then the next level way I was thinking about it was that, Facebook bought Oculus and has invested billions of dollars in virtual reality because they want to essentially own the metaverse, the virtual world. They really want to plant a flag in this next generation of computing. We could spend all day prognosticating whether or not VR takes off, whether AR takes off, all these things. But we know what Facebook's objective was and is. It's to own the virtual and the VR AR space. And so it makes you wonder, like, well, if that were to come to pass, what kind of a leader would they be? And I think that we see from the way that they treat their own executives that they're probably going to take a similar stance, because you see that even nowadays, with the kinds of people that they ban on Facebook and the potential conservative bias. And I don't know, on a corporate level, I think that there's a conversation to be had, but speaking to actual employees, I could say that anecdotally, most of the people I speak with have a very strong conservative, anti-conservative bias. And I think that impacts the company. So basically, I just thought narratively, it made a lot of sense where if Facebook were to get their goal, how would they rule the digital world? And I think how they treated Palmer and how they reacted to the whole thing is indicative of what they would do, where I'm open to the argument that a private company should be able to fire an employee if they create a political firestorm or if they don't like their political beliefs. It's illegal in California, but ideologically, I'm open to that argument. But what I really found most troubling was just how, it's not the original crime, it's the cover up. So it was how they exiled Palmer, how they lied to Facebook employees about what had happened, how they told the Facebook employees that Palmer was requesting additional time. And basically, I was in touch with a lot of these people at Oculus and at Facebook, and a lot of people leaked information to me, not because they were supportive of Palmer or even liked Palmer, but because they thought that what was happening was so unfair and they wanted to make sure it got out there. And it was weird to me, though I guess a nice compliment, that a lot of early Oculus employees who I contacted before the book came out and gave them some chapters, they were like grateful to finally just know what happened with Palmer, because no one had ever told them the truth. And, for any company, I think that's bad. But for a company like Facebook that is allegedly based on transparency and being so open, I found it to be especially damning. But hopefully more people know, and people do seem to be paying more attention to what big tech companies do for good and for bad.
And Lucky Palmer's story is interesting because, like you write about, he started out just experimenting he was in Long Beach living in a trailer, right? When he did his first experiments. And that's very Ready Player One, huh?
Yeah. Well, so just to clarify, his name's Palmer Luckey.
I'm sorry.
Though a lot of people
Luckey.
switch it, but it's always so interesting to me because it's like, again, the fiction versus the reality thing. Like if I was going to be writing a fictional book about this kid living in a trailer whose life is pretty rags to riches and his life changed, it's like, so much of the entrepreneurial success is based on luck. So what better name for a character than like Palmer Luckey?
Yeah.
And like I related to him too, and really loved this idea that he was living in a trailer in his parents' driveway. He was 19 years old, and he had gutted out this trailer to be like the ultimate mad scientist laboratory, and he was just building VR headsets. And obviously, like all of us, he wanted to find success in life, but that was like what he was going to do. That was what his passion was, and he was going to continue to do that no matter what. And lo and behold, some circumstances fall into place. John Carmack, the legendary game maker, got in touch with him, really liked what he was making, and then the first chapter of the book is called "The Boy Who Lived to Mod," which was my nod to Harry Potter, to The Boy Who Lived, because I always thought of like Palmer's story as like a Harry Potter story where he's just like an ordinary kid doing his thing. Life's not super awesome. And then he gets thrust into this magical world of Silicon Valley, and you see the pros and the cons of all that. And I guess that Mark Zuckerberg would be the Voldemort in that analogy.
In the book, it's this question of, I think it's always on our minds. Is Facebook good or evil? Is Google good or evil? Are mass media corporations, do they have our best interest in mind, or is there sin in that they are indifferent? Because it's kind of like Moby Dick. Like Moby Dick is more or less doesn't care about the crew, but they can't stop harassing him, and that ends their downfall. Right. So it's like, do you think Facebook is evil, or they just are so big they can't take a good stand on everything? Like, that's a very broad question, but
it's a really great question. Because one, I think it's incredibly important and something that I hope a lot of people are thinking of. And two, it's like basically I wake up every day wondering that.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of things to break down with that question. One, I don't think Facebook is evil. Like I don't think they're a force of evil. But then, like semantically, like what does that mean, evil? I think that the book, through the Oculus story, gives you a really good sense of what Facebook is all about. And I'll mention a few examples. Like one is that before all the political drama with Palmer, Mark Zuckerberg in June 2015 wrote like a really long email to his executives about his vision for AR and VR. And I included most of the letter. I thought it was a really good insight into what he was thinking. And at the top of it, he sort of prefaces this by saying that he's going to talk about the business solutions in addition to the most important thing is the value that this technology will provide to humanity. And that's just a really crazy way of looking at it. Like I would never, I write my books for entertainment and to teach lessons, but I never think of what I do as improving humanity. Like that's a very grand way of looking at what you do. And I think that there's a lot of evidence, certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence, that Facebook has done the opposite to that with humanity, has not helped humanity very much. But I do think that he sort of views himself as like a benevolent dictator in that respect, and it gives you a good sense of his way of thinking. And then the other thing too is, I think it goes back to what you said at the top, that like with politics, you can look at two people can look at the same situation and reach a different conclusion based on their differing views. And I think that happens a lot. So I think one person's good and another person's evil. And I think the real problem that I have with Facebook and Google and a lot of these companies is how non-transparent they are, or how deceitful they are in what they do. I can't speak to the algorithms at Facebook about whether they bias against certain political ideologies. Like there's a lot of, conservatives who think that's the case. It seems like that's the case, but I don't have actual evidence. But I do have a lot of evidence that they treat conservative employees differently and worse. And that I've spoken to a lot of conservative employees who have been discriminated against and have presented me with tangible evidence that that's the case. And like I said earlier, like Facebook's a private company, and whether or not it's illegal in California, I'm open to the argument that they should be able to run the business the way they want. But that's not how they present themselves to the world. They present themselves as a fair platform. And I think that a lot of the problem is I just wish that a lot of these companies were more honest about what they were really about. Facebook is a mission-oriented company. They're trying to connect people. They use algorithms without telling their users to try to achieve certain objectives for their ads and also for social issues that they care about.
Right.
And they should just, unless they're going to be transparent about it, then there's going to be a lot of concern and a lot of collateral damage to that.
Well, when you're that big to say, to express any sort of political leaning, you're going to lose a lot of your audience, right? You're going to lose a lot of your users. And no one predicted that. No one predicted that a corporation would get so big that it would influence history, influence relationships, take up so much time that it's like we're on the verge of a new frontier where they're as big. It's like as powerful as the government in some ways, you know?
It really is.
Yeah.
And like another good example on this one, I was not in my book and I'm maybe going to butcher a little bit, but like I remember at Google, they did an initiative to help increase voter turnout. This was, I believe, in the 2016 election. And so they made changes to their platform to increase voter turnout. And it did work. But it was, and it targeted, I believe, Hispanic voters. But those Hispanic voters voted for the wrong candidate that Google wanted. And so it's like that is anti-democracy where you're,
right.
Where it's not actually about voter turnout. It's about voter turnout for the people who are going to vote for the candidate that you want. And then there's just the whole other aspect to it where I think that social media, as well as the media, have done such an incredible job at making us all terrible communicators and going to hot takes and hating each other when really we don't. Like I remember I was meeting with a friend yesterday and he mentioned a cartoon where it's like two dogs with a fence in between them and they're barking at each other. And it was supposed to be like an analogy for the internet. And then once the fence is removed, they kind of like walk away from each other. Like we're barking, but we're not really going to fight. Right. And I said, that to me was like how the internet was like 2006 through 2016 or whatever. Now I feel like it's two dogs on opposite sides of a fence who initially are like, hey, and they're fine. And then the media is like, hey, that dog has a bone. You don't have a bone. Or that dog's getting this and you don't have that. And like basically creating all this conflicts that they hate each other for not, they didn't have to hate each other. Then the fence is removed and they just destroy each other.
That's so dark. It's true. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the platform I've always liked the most is Twitter. There's a lot of toxic behavior on there, but I did like that it lets you have the timeline be chronological, so it's not being sorted by an algorithm for you. But even just in the past few days, I've had to switch it from the home screen where they choose what you see to I feel like more and more they're trying to get away from that, and that also makes me wary because it kind of gets back to your question of like, I don't think either of these companies are good or bad. I think it's in the eye of the beholder, but they're all algorithmically based and they give the user so little information about what's informing these algorithms and so little choice. Like that's the other thing too. I remember realizing one day, because when I went to like the Facebook settings, like how can I change my feed? And the settings the options you have are less than if you were to just like press start in a typical video game. Like for something that connects 2 billion people, they really give you so little power to control it. Like that seems wild. You should have so much control over what you want to see.
If it's your portal to the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're all competing with each other, all the different platforms. And going back to console wars, something I thought was really interesting was how you got into how legally Sega could make fun of Nintendo in its commercials, or how like, you know what I mean? Or Nintendo could make fun of Sega. Like, was that one of the first examples of like mainstream media, interactive media corporations being able to denigrate each other in their ads? Or like, is that legal?
I know that part of it was, it was a time when Sega was in like more of like a smaller, nothing to lose attitude, and Nintendo would often send them cease and desist letters.
Right.
And I think in most cases, Tom Kalinske and Sega obliged, but as Tom told me, like, but we already got the impact. Like we had it out for a week and people saw it. So we don't need it anymore. To me, that was my first memory of it being so heated. I know that there was like the Pepsi challenge and like Coke versus Pepsi and Nike versus Reebok, but I don't think that they were they certainly weren't as aggressive head to head. There could be examples out there, and maybe listeners will tell us, and I'd love to see those commercials from the 80s and 90s that were as blatant, but it really was a different level. And, just like Sega went after Nintendo head on.
Yeah, they sure did. And it's interesting how that became the conversation at school. Like, oh, did you hear this? Did you hear that? It's almost like the Republicans versus Democrats, you know what I mean?
It really is. There was such a sense of tribalism. And I guess I know that I look back through rose-colored glasses because it was my childhood, but I did feel like it was like respectful. Like, I would talk about how great Genesis is and make fun of the Nintendo kid or whatever, but like we still played football together. We still had fun. I would still go to his house and play it. Like, and versus nowadays, what you see online when, what people experience when they think of console wars, it's a lot more heated. It's a lot more lacking of respect, which I think is just indicative of a lot of where we are culturally and the tools you have to do that.
And that's kind of what's kind of endearing about your first book, and that it's like you remember a time when things hadn't escalated, the tribalism hadn't escalated to where it is now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I'll say, for the past few months, my full-time focus has been on the Console Wars documentary. And aside from how much fun I'm having revisiting interviews with Tom Kalinske and Alan Nilsson and Peter Main and Howard Lincoln, all these characters that I loved and wrote about in Console Wars, like the single most enjoyable part of working on the Console Wars documentary is that unlike what I see in my daily life when I log online or read the news, or unlike what I experienced reporting on the history of the future and what I've received as a reaction from some people to my covering of Palmer being a Trump supporter, like just covering stuff from the 90s, everything feels so much happier. And again, I know part of it is because of looking back fondly on an era from the 90s, but a lot of it too is just the media coverage and how it was not trying to be sensational in a good versus bad way. It wasn't talking about, what Sonic lacked or what Nintendo was, what Nintendo executives were doing and why we shouldn't buy products from them because they had made certain comments. Right. And it was just like, it was a really nice time, generally speaking. And it's just been nice to, I guess, escape to that period for a little bit of time again. So
that's been your main focus, is writing and producing and working on that show right now?
No, well, so there's two projects. There's a television series, that's going to be directed by Jordan Voight Roberts and written by Mike Rizzolio and produced by Seth and Evan and Scott and myself and Jonah. And that we have a pilot script for that. I guess I can't really get into much details about where we are with that process, but it's moving along really nicely. I loved reading that pilot script. It felt like it was Mike's voice and it felt like his, but it also felt like it was really inspired by the book. Like it felt like a good synergy, which doesn't always happen with an adaptation. And then there's also the documentary. Both of them are going to be premiering and available on CBS All Access, the streaming platform for CBS. But it is two different projects. So we are, we're close to finishing up with the documentary, hoping to be done by the end of the year, and then maybe debut it in early 2020. And that's the stuff that is giving me that warm feeling, because Jonah and I are dealing so much with just like archival material and like the other day, like for me, it's like Christmas, like the best thing ever is just getting good archival, because so much of it was lost from that era, and like we got an MTV interrupting the broadcast from 1992, of like what was going on at CES, and I was like, oh my god, this is like, I get a lot of my joy from my work, and I was like, I felt bad because like my wife was telling me stuff that was like, I guess, good news in our personal life, but I was like so much happier to just get good archival from 1992 MTV.
That's awesome, man. And you are working on another book project, or is it too soon to talk about that?
We could talk about it briefly, as I mentioned to you before the show. I still don't know what I'm going to work on. I guess one of the big takeaways for me with both of these books, or specifically with the second one, is that any book I write is probably going to be a really long one and take several years, whereas I thought maybe Console Wars was just uniquely long. But I like getting into the world of the characters. I like tangenting a little bit to try to get the cultural things. And And so I'm looking at a bunch of different options. But one story that I'm looking to tell, probably as a documentary, more so than a book, but a story that I would like to, I always go into it like, what do I want to read about? What do I want to hear about? And I've been corresponding with Ross Ulbricht, the creator of Silk Road, the dark web, Amazon for drugs, or however it was known.
Right.
And I find that to be a very fascinating story that touches on a lot of important tech topics from our time. And, he's never really had his story told. And so I'm going to try to help make that happen, probably as a documentary, because I'd like to hear it told in his voice. But that there's a lot of interesting aspects to that case. A couple of FBI agents ended up going to jail for corruption in the case.
Oh, wow.
He received double life sentences, which is pretty unprecedented for nonviolent crimes. And people, like my wife asked me, like, do I think that was unfair? And at this point, I don't know. Like, I think that's the fun for me, is that I'm not going into this like an activist trying to get Ross out of prison. I'm going into it like I'm just very curious to know what happened and to form my opinions after I get that information, and to have the luxury of hearing it from the horse's mouth as opposed to other people that have been talking about what the horse has been up to for years.
Someone else wrote the headline, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I bet he feels, I mean, and if you don't want to talk about this, it's fine, but like having someone to talk to must be cool, like amazing. I don't know. I imagine
that's how I would feel too. I also don't want to, that's like a way that makes me feel good about myself and benefits myself. So I try not to put too much into that.
Yeah.
He does have a fiance, and he has his mom who's been a great advocate on his behalf. But I do try to be conscious of the fact that he's probably not corresponding with a lot of people, and to try to ask him questions that he's not thinking about, that he isn't getting from his mom or from his fiance, and to just talk about different aspects of his life. And then for me, because I've never been to prison, I have so little experience with that world. Like that whole thing is very fascinating to me too. Just what's it like to be locked away and have lost your control, and to know that you're going to have to be there for the rest of your life unless some, crazy clemency sort of thing were to happen. Like that's, unfortunately it's something that's, he's one of a statistic of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are in that situation. Some deserved, some not. But, just that his day-to-day life is so different from yours and mine.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. But all the books, or all your work, has this theme of the narrative of how we maintain our humanity and our good sides as the world changes and as things become like not so certain, right? Like the idea of the continuation of the human spirit as forces outside of us collapse upon us. I don't know. It seems
I think there's a lot of merit to what you're saying. And I would also say that it's the characters in the book are protagonists in that collapsing of the world, the changing of the world.
Yeah.
Palmer Luckey's trying to change the face of video games. Tom Kalinske is changing what video games mean. So as the world is changing around him, he is an agent of change, and Ross was an agent of change as well. My interest is always more in the people. Maybe it's because I'm just a technological layperson, but like I remember part of when I think part of what in hindsight really inspired me was I was reading Barbarians at the Gate, which is, one of the most famous behind the scenes business books of all time, about Nabisco and the cigarette company, RJR Nabisco. And like I remember one part of it was that his son, one of the main character's sons, had either died or been in a terrible accident, was in a coma, and then it just moved on to like the next business scene. And I was like, that's like so traumatizing. How I'm sure that had an impact on his life or the people around him. And I just wanted to know more about that. So I'm always very interested in the human side of these stories and the universal side of these stories. And I think that's why, even though Console Wars is a story of the 90s and History of the Future is a story about the teens, like I think they'll be universally accessible. Like my hope is that 10 years from now, I was very conscious of the fact that I wanted to write a book about VR and about Oculus and about Palmer that 10 years from now would be as relevant then as it is now, because I didn't know whether VR was going to succeed, and I didn't think that really mattered. I think that what mattered was that it was a story about this group of people coming together and accomplishing this thing that was seemingly impossible, and how they couldn't have done it without all four of the people, with Brendan Arib and Nate Mitchell and Mike Antonoff. And maybe they don't all see it that way all the time, but they really, like, a lot of times collaboration is key to entrepreneurial success.
That's cool, man. Well, Blake, I appreciate your time and I appreciate your thoughts. And I want to invite the audience to follow you on your social media channel. So where do you like to direct people?
I really like I said, Twitter's my favorite platform. I'm at Blake J. Harris, NYC. I'm really compulsive about replying. So if you contact me, I'll almost definitely reply. I'd love to hear what you thought of the book, good or bad, if you have any questions. I also feel like I've been fortunate enough to be brought into the world of Sega and into the world of Oculus. And as such, I feel like I'm sort of have a responsibility to share what I've learned with others. So if you have questions, I almost always get back to them.
That's amazing. What a great invitation. Well, thank you very much. And be sure to check out both of his books. They're both on Amazon. You can listen to them on Audible and digitally. They're available digitally too, I imagine.
Yep, both are available as ebooks.
All right, cool. Thank you, Blake. Take care. Sega vs. Nintendo, David vs. Goliath, Sonic vs. Mario, a challenger arises. Marketing and strategy, the tortoise and the hare. Defined a generation, here's the story, we were there.
In 1983, E.T. the game, a catastrophic failure and a shame. But the start of an insane war, Atari and television Coleco. But too many choices just divided the people.
Shigeru Miyamoto knew it couldn't be the end, so he built a game called Donkey Kong, which helped to launch Nintendo. Through guerrilla marketing, he shook the planet from its slumber when he introduced the soon-to-be iconic Brooklyn Plumber.
And an entertainment company from Hawaii would enter, built on slot machines but became a game contender. They started off slowly, but what helped them get across was a sleek black system and a speedy edge.
It was Sega vs. Nintendo,
David vs. Goliath,
Sonic vs. Mario,
a challenger arises.
defined a generation
Like no system had before.
A battleground in every store, choose your side, console wars. Sega vs. Nintendo,
David vs. Goliath,
Sonic vs. Mario,
a challenger arises.
defined a generation
Like no system had before.
A battleground in every store, choose your side, console wars. Nintendo used relationships with Walmart and with Target, keeping Sonic off the shelves. They monopolized the market with a 95% share. That's ridiculous. So Sega got meticulous with marketing conspicuous.
Yeah, they hired a top dog, formerly of Mattel. Turned the game around and new strategies would prevail. Toys were just fads, but games were big businesses. Sega went hard with the relaunch of the Genesis.
While Minoru Arakawa wanted strict control of every gaming console that Nintendo sold, when the game Genie dropped, they sued Galoo. Anger in the players with their stuck-up attitude.
I heard the Genesis claim to do what Nintendo don't. They skipped the kids and marketed to the young adults with major licenses like Spider-Man and Michael Jackson. And Game Genie action, the war was on and
It was Sega vs. Nintendo,
David vs. Goliath,
Sonic vs. Mario,
a challenger arises.
defined a generation
Like no system had before.
A battleground in every store, choose your side, console wars. Sega vs. Nintendo,
David vs. Goliath,
Sonic vs. Mario,
a challenger arises.
defined a generation
Like no system had before.
A battleground in every store, choose your side, console wars. In 1992, the evidence was there. Sega's lead was gaining with an increased market share. So Nintendo leveled up with that Super FX chip. The 3D looked amazing, and Star Fox was a hit.
They hit them off with portables, Sega's next strategy. Game Gear was tight, but it burned through some batteries. Blood of Mortal Kombat, shower scene and Night Trap. Congress built the ratings war cause parents didn't like
But then
that.
Donkey Kong Country and Mario Kart brought Nintendo to the finish line and showed a lot of heart. With timeless characters that we all still adore. From Pikachu to Mega Man to Wario and more. And Sega dropped the
32X to Sega CD to Dreamcast, but it was not the same. Sega was out the game. We had some good times, the past was a blast though. And later Sonic even made a cameo in Smash
It
Bros.
was Sega vs. Nintendo,
David vs. Goliath,
Sonic vs. Mario,
a challenger arises.
defined a generation
Like no system had before.
A battleground in every store, choose your side, console wars. Sega vs. Nintendo,
David vs. Goliath,
Sonic vs. Mario,
a challenger arises.
defined a generation
Like no system had before.
A battleground in every store, choose your side, console wars. That was, of course, Console Wars by Mega Ran and myself. And that was based on the book Console Wars by Blake J. Harris. Thank you for your time, man. Awesome talking to you. Thanks for being on the show. We have right now, it's time for the MC Lars Patreon Larson of the week. This week we got Morgan Miller, great dude, photographer, talented man. He actually came to see me with the Aquabats in Asbury Park and took some awesome pictures. So this is Morgan Miller's shout out, calling in. Let's see what he's got to say.
Hey Lars, this is Morgan Miller. We met at the most recent concert. It was my first concert that I've been to in a while. My first one I've seen you in. It was the one in New Jersey at the Stone Pony, Asbury Park. Met you with my wife. And you honestly are one of the most genuine and kind people I've ever met in my life. Favorite song by you would be a difficult choice. It's got to be a tie between This Gigantic Robot Kills and Mr. Raven. Just because I'm a fan of Poe, and Gigantic Robot Kills was actually the first song of yours that I heard and got me into your music. But yeah, you're a great guy, and I was coming out of a rough spot, and you helped me see that there was still a lot of good in the world and a lot of love. So thank you for that. Anyway, good meeting you. Take care and hope you're doing well.
Thank you, Morgan. That means a lot to me. Thanks for being on the show. Next week, ladies and gentlemen, we got Suzanne McDermott, whose song, The Roswell Incident, I covered for Indie Rocket Science. She's a teacher, a healer, a musician. Very interesting woman. Really cool to get to talk to her. So tune in next week. In the meantime, nerdcore.com for the dates. Come see me in Oakley Dokley on the road. Until then, have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone.